Welcome to False Claims, Real Consequences.
Welcome to False Claims, Real Consequences with Stephen Teller. Steve is an employment and whistleblower attorney with more than 25 years of experience representing individuals in discrimination, retaliation, and False Claims Act cases. He has helped clients take on some of the largest companies in the country and has secured significant recoveries in cases involving fraud against the federal government. I'm Lisa Mosbey, your host, and today we're talking about what actually makes a whistleblower case strong. Welcome back, Steve.
Thanks for having me.
Steve, when someone comes to you with a potential whistleblower case, what tends to stand out early as a sign that there is real evidence behind it?
Well, the first step for me is always understanding the fraud. I mean, what is the person telling me about? And often they are an expert in the area.
Sure.
I think, the evidence behind it then kind of flows from that. Like, what's the story first? And then frequently the person has, taken screenshots or, saved email or things like that. There may be invoices or documents or other papers that tend to show the fraud, the documents, the import documents that one fills out for customs are not accessible publicly, but the person has them behind the scenes if they're a customs broker. So great, they grab those documents as appropriate. That's the kind of whatever's there in the background is the evidence we need.
So, Steve, let's just create some clarity around this. What actually separates a strong suspicion of fraud versus evidence that can actually support a False Claims Act case?
Well, evidence comes in a bunch of forms, right? I mean, a person's testimony is evidence. And so the credibility of the whistleblower telling the story does matter quite a bit. In addition, that person is hopefully in a position to gather documents from inside of the company that's committing the fraud. So emails, statements, invoices, even calendar meeting notes, I suppose. It just depends on the circumstances we're trying to prove.
And then, of those documents that you mentioned, what carries the most weight? Does it matter if it's an email versus a ledger from an accounting book? Is evidence weighted at all when evaluating these cases?
Well, it's super hard to answer what type of evidence is most valuable is the type that, proves the pieces we need to prove, right? So that, there's intentional violation of the law that's causing the government damages. And if we have, whatever pieces of that, let me illustrate something funny. If the government, if the police come because there's a drug raid at a house, do you know they often take the telephone bill?
No.
Why would they do that? The person
Client
who's
list?
getting the phone bill, the person who's getting the phone bill at the address of the house definitely, has some connection to that house, right? So the police are helping to prove who owns the house or who lives at the house by taking the phone bill. So there's all kinds of pieces of evidence all surrounding a fraud that may be super important because it establishes, Bob read that email. And it could be a tiny thing. So we just try to pull together all the pieces that we need to show as much of the scheme as we reasonably can and call it good, And if we're now convinced, yep, that looks like there's probably fraud there, then we bring it to the Department of Justice to start asking for more documents and interviewing people and really using the resources of the federal government to look at that.
So it would be safe to say that the evidence that you're compiling will tend to show a pattern over time more than it being just a single incident or a single document.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think about evidence like it's a little bit like a boat on a lake. If
Mhm.
you're going forward under a motor, you're creating waves and ripples. As I walk around my house or my office, I touch things, I leave DNA, I bought something with a credit card, there's an electronic record, there's, thousands of little things that are happening all around. We're creating evidence all the time. And so, looking through the pieces, the things that made the person most suspicious about the problem are probably the place to start in terms of what evidence to gather.
And then Just out of curiosity, where do people most often get it wrong if they do get it wrong? That's just an assumption on
Yeah.
my part. But where do they most often get it wrong when they're thinking about what counts as useful evidence?
The most common problem is, in terms of, most common problem is when, not so much with evidence, but with the perception of wrongdoing by the company, having a mistake there, because there will be many things that are, unimportant regulatory issues that the government doesn't really care about, that, I think, as in my small role as a billing clerk, I think are important. And it may or may not be important. We don't know. And so the biggest concern I have for people is when they feel like their company is doing something wrong and they start opposing it without looking at the big picture of how important this is, right? I don't want somebody to get tripped up and in a big conflict with their job because, somebody, goes through California stops at the four-way stops when they really should come to a full and complete stop.
Mhm.
I mean, that's important in the right situation, but it's not important enough for the federal government to spend a lot of time on. So we want to be sure that there really are damages stemming from this violation, that the government's going to care about it. That's number one.
That makes sense. Then can someone still have a viable case if they don't have direct access to internal documents or other information? I'm trying to get at how can they support or substantiate the claim before they bring it to you?
And it's just super hard to answer in the general because there's, which of the interesting documents will matter will depend on, is it, customs fraud, or is it, mortgage issues.
Let's take one example. Let's go with customs fraud.
So, for example, if we wanted to look at one of the best cases I had in a customs fraud situation was where my client was um, having to manage the documents. He had access to the submissions to the government, and he had access to the purchase and sale documents for the product that was being imported, and he could just prove the lie. The value was being understated very substantially to the government. They bought it high, they sold it high, and they told the government it was low in value. So we had a very easy case, although it was small, because he easily had tracked, those documents for each of the, 100 some transactions. So having the paperwork to prove it is definitely helpful. It gets the government involved quickly.
Steve, let's go in another direction. I'd like a second example. And I think let's talk about mortgages. What would that look like for a fraud case or a case that we were bringing forth?
Mortgages are a little complicated because the federal government guarantees them. So it's not like the federal government is paying the mortgage. It's only paying it if the borrower defaults.
Yes.
Now that happens. The government's on the hook for it in a few different programs. First-time home buyers, veterans, right? So it does happen that they guarantee the mortgages. And so if the mortgage seller is overselling, right? Too big a mortgage for this person, and the documentation isn't there to prove they qualify for that, well, the incentive for the mortgage seller is to sell more. But if they're not qualifying under the terms of the guarantee program, and the mortgage seller says they are, and then there's a default, now the government's on the hook for that. And that fraud made more defaults and the government on the hook more, right? So that one's a little complicated, but with those, that's the scheme. We've got seen how that works a few times.
And where does timing start to matter when it comes to gathering and preserving evidence, whether it's in the customs case, the mortgage case, or any case for that matter?
It's much easier to gather evidence while you're still employed. It's much easier to pursue a False Claims Act case while you're still employed in the place. It's more stressful that way, but it's easier to be continuing to gather evidence if needed. There's a caveat to that. The government doesn't want you to continue to gather evidence after reporting to them without their guidance. They would want to be involved, right? But you still learn things. You still are involved after the case starts with the ongoing time, the ongoing fraud. So timing, you're asking me, like, when do you start gathering evidence? I mean, I think you just when you see it, when you think it becomes important, like when you call the lawyer. As soon as you start to think maybe there's an issue, then let's get some guidance on roadmap of how to handle it. Start gathering the evidence early.
I can see how sometimes you don't start to gather evidence early only because you don't know. Like you're questioning, you're wondering. So, whenever you do, when that light switch goes on and say, there's just been too many incidents here, too many times this hasn't seemed right, start to gather evidence at that point. If somebody has a moral dilemma and they leave the company because their suspicions were on high alert and they leave, is that too late to actually make a claim?
No, absolutely not. I mean, what you brought with you on the way out the door is the evidence we have at that point. But as I said before, your testimony is very valuable evidence. And, the documents that you do have are valuable. And the government has the power to investigate. And so if I have a credible person who, brought up a big problem and got fired immediately, instead of the company just explaining why it's not actually a problem, they suddenly fire them, something suspicious there. They're a credible person, they understand the field, and they know what the issue was. That is a case that makes sense to bring to the government one way or another, right? Now, maybe we go to an Office of Inspector General report and we initiate some sort of investigation separate from the False Claims Act just to see if the government wants to take this seriously. We can do that in some situations. We have to be careful about original source issues, but we can. So there's some nuance in how we can handle a case like that.
And here's where I want to leave it today, Steve. When someone is trying to decide whether they're ready to move forward, what tends to make that decision clearer? What advice do you have for folks who might be listening right now and having those thoughts?
I mean, you just call a lawyer. We're eager to hear the story, help you move it forward. Sometimes that's, sorry, there isn't a case here that I can see, make some more calls. But often it's, well, yeah, here, can you gather this or that? And we might have something, let's talk about it. And that can be really helpful to a person who's kind of wondering, am I right or am I wrong here? I'm getting in trouble at work. I don't understand. Why don't they explain to me why, all that confusion can be cleared up quite a bit by just 15, 20 minutes on the phone.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for your insight. And thank you for joining me for today.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's it for today's episode of False Claims, Real Consequences with Stephen Teller. If you believe you've witnessed fraud against the federal government or have questions about whether you have the evidence to support a whistleblower case, you can learn more at stellarlaw.com. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the show, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.